I've spent my entire professional life studying the Titanic, but nothing could have prepared me for how deeply the ship would eventually consume me. My name is Dr. Michael Hartley, and I'm a maritime historian specializing in the RMS Titanic. For 20 years, I've dedicated my life to understanding every minute detail of that tragic voyage. The passengers, the crew, the intricate social dynamics, the fatal design flaws. What began as academic fascination gradually transformed into an obsession that would, ultimately, unravel my entire perception of reality. The artifact came from a private collection in Southampton. An elderly collector, Harold Jameson, had contacted me after hearing about my reputation. He claimed to have something unusual. Personal effects recovered from the wreckage that had never been properly documented. Most researchers would have been skeptical, but my hunger for untold stories always outweighed my caution. When the package arrived, it was surprisingly modest. A small leather satchel, water-stained and fragile, contained what appeared to be personal documents, a tarnished locket, and a small fragment of fabric. The moment my fingers brushed against the items, something felt different. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The fabric was what caught my attention first. A small, roughly triangular piece of third-class passenger clothing. Coarse, dark wool with intricate stitching. As I examined it under my magnifying glass, the edge unexpectedly caught my skin. A thin, precise cut opened across my palm, tiny droplets of blood immediately welling up. I should have cleaned the wound immediately. I should have been more careful. But something about the artifact held me transfixed. The blood seemed to absorb into the fabric. Not seep, not stain, but absorb, like the material was drinking it. For a split second, I could have sworn the fabric's color deepened, becoming richer, more vibrant. That was the first moment I heard the whispers. Faint at first. So quiet I initially thought it was the wind or the ambient noise of my study. Fragmented words in a language that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Desperate. Terrified. No escape. Water rising. God, help me. I dismissed it as imagination. Exhaustion from weeks of intense research. But as the days progressed, the whispers became more persistent, more defined. By the third night, I knew something fundamental had changed. The dreams began. Vivid, horrifyingly detailed nightmares that felt less like dreams and more like memories. I wasn't just observing, I was experiencing. I was Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant from a small village outside Dublin. Third-class passenger, dreaming of a better life in America. Scraped together every penny for that ticket on the Titanic. In these dreams, these memories, I could feel the cramped conditions of steerage, the smell of unwashed bodies, the constant background noise of children crying, adults speaking in a dozen different languages, the hope, the desperation, and then the ice. The first impact was nothing like the dramatic Hollywood depictions. A subtle shudder. Most passengers didn't even realize something was wrong. But Thomas knew. Something in his bones understood the terrible mathematics of what was happening. Water. Cold. Rising. Panic would come later. First would be the terrible, suffocating realization of doom. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, more real. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my lungs burning, convinced I was drowning. My sheets would be damp, smelling of salt and industrial coal smoke. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't explain. The cut on my hand didn't heal properly. What began as a simple wound transformed into something different. The skin around the cut remained perpetually raw, with an iridescent quality that shifted colors when caught in certain lights. Blues and grays, like deep ocean water. Sometimes, if I stared too long, I could swear the wound moved. Not visibly, but with a subtle, internal rippling. My research became increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, my long-term research partner, approached me during a conference. Her concern etched deep in the lines of her face. "Michael, you look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "When was the last time you slept?" I couldn't tell her about the dreams, about Thomas, about the memories that weren't mine. The artifacts from the Southampton collection began to consume my every waking moment. I catalogued them obsessively, discovering minute details that had escaped previous researchers. A ticket stub with a partial fingerprint, a fragment of a letter, water damaged but still partially legible, a brass button from a third-class steward's uniform. Each item seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The whispers grew stronger. During the day, they were subtle. Background noise that could be mistaken for the hum of fluorescent lights or the distant murmur of traffic. But at night, they became a symphony of terror. Hundreds of voices, overlapping, desperate. "The water. Can't breathe, too cold. The water, can't breathe." I started keeping a journal. Not for academic purposes, but as a desperate attempt to maintain my sanity, to track the progression of whatever was happening to me. Entry, October 17th. The dreams are becoming more specific. I'm not just experiencing Thomas's memories. I'm beginning to understand his entire life. His hopes, his fears, the smell of his mother's bread, the calluses on his hands from working the fields, the weight of his single best suit, purchased specifically for the journey to America. I know the exact moment he realized the ship was doomed. It wasn't a sudden revelation, not a dramatic moment of terror, just a slow, terrible understanding that crept into his consciousness. like ice-cold water. The cut on my hand had started to change. Small, intricate patterns began to emerge around the wound. Patterns that looked like nautical maps, like the complex network of corridors inside the Titanic. Thin, blue-grey lines that seemed to move when I wasn't directly looking at them. My sleep became a battlefield. One moment, I was Dr. Michael Hartley, respected historian, meticulous researcher. The next, I was Thomas Riley, poor, desperate, trapped. The boundary between us was dissolving, and something else was emerging. Something that had been waiting, buried deep beneath the cold Atlantic waters for over a century. Something that wanted to be remembered. By November, I was losing myself. My apartment became a sprawling archive of Titanic ephemera. Walls covered in maritime maps, passenger lists, and photographs. But these weren't just historical documents anymore. They were alive. The photographs. God, the photographs. Third-class passengers, frozen in sepia-toned moments that would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces would turn slightly. Eyes would follow me. Not all of them, just select images. Always the ones showing people who would die that night. Thomas's memories were no longer confined to dreams. I could taste the salt water during faculty meetings, feel the impossible cold of the Atlantic while lecturing about maritime engineering. Sometimes, mid-sentence, I would forget who I was. Was I the professor, or the desperate young immigrant clutching a wooden panel in freezing water? The wound on my hand had become a map. Literally. Intricate blue-grey lines now formed a precise topographical representation of the Titanic's lower decks. If I traced the lines with my finger, I could feel the ship's internal layout, could sense the exact location of each corridor, each compartment, the precise angles where water would first breach the hull. Dr. Moreau stopped calling. My department chair suggested a sabbatical. I was becoming something else. Something between historian and haunting. One night, I discovered something in Thomas's memories that chilled me more than the phantom maritime cold that now perpetually surrounded me. He wasn't supposed to be on that ship. His original ticket, for a smaller vessel leaving a week earlier, had been lost. Stolen, actually, by a man whose name was never recorded in any manifest. A man whose face Thomas remembered with a strange, specific terror. A man who seemed to know what was coming. The whispers grew more insistent. No longer just memories of terror and drowning. Now, they carried something else. A warning. He is coming. He has always been coming. I realized then that the haunting wasn't about the ship. It was about something much older, much darker, and I was just beginning to understand. Christmas came, and with it, a strange peace. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. Thomas's memories became less a torment and more a companionship. I understood now that he wasn't trying to possess me. He was trying to warn me. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau visited me on Christmas Eve. I hadn't seen her in months, and the concern in her eyes told me I looked as fractured as I felt. "I brought you something," she said, placing an old leather-bound journal on my desk. "It was my grandmother's. She was a maritime historian too. I thought, well, I thought you might appreciate it." The journal belonged to a researcher from the 1930s, someone who had been investigating the Titanic long before modern technology made such research easier. As Elizabeth left, I opened the pages. Tucked between yellowed sheets was a photograph. Not of the Titanic, not of any passenger. A man, standing alone on a foggy pier. His face partially obscured, but familiar in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The man from Thomas's stolen memory. That night, the wound on my hand, now a living map of maritime tragedy, began to speak differently. No longer desperate whispers of drowning, but something more measured, more intentional. Some stories are meant to be remembered. Some warnings must be carried. I understood then that Thomas's spirit wasn't a victim. He was a guardian. The cold that had haunted me for months began to recede. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe. Enough that I could think clearly. Outside my window, snow fell. Pure. Silent. And for the first time since touching that artifact, I felt something like hope. The story wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid. At least, not completely.